And another one is, of course, well, the strategic nature of communication. I don't know how to. I mean, it's such a deep subject and a broad subject as well. And I wanted to hear a little bit more from you, Jason, about how you actually work between not just the two languages, the English and the Japanese, but between the two cultures. Because we have had this as a recurring thread here that speaking the language, it's good, but sometimes just because you can say something, it doesn't mean that you should say it because of the cultural background, because of the situation you are in. So, how do you see that? Let's say the cultural differences. How do they transpire in the language?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And certainly there's so much to touch on in terms of, not only moving from one language to another, and that's what I mean when I say there's a huge difference between translation and localization, right? Because being able to translate completely accurately between one language, or from one language to another, is an incredible skill. And I really admire people who, for example, simultaneous interpreters, their ability to just quickly convey two messages back and forth between those two different languages is just an incredible thing. But as you say, it's more often than not, it's not an act of just getting the exact what of the message right. It's more a question of who are we talking to, what is the correct timing, and specifically why are we presenting this message, right? So, to take an example from social media, the things that tend to trend well in English maybe don't trend as well in Japanese, for example. And that could be just because, you know, different turns of phrase, different plays on words can suddenly become popular in one language that there really is no way of translating that, because of all the inferred meaning and all the connected meanings that have to come along with it in order for that original joke or that original message to resonate with people. But I think in a business context, it's a lot easier to think about. Um, let's say that there's an urgent issue that needs to be solved. Like, you can think about, not quite crisis management, but hey, if we don't address this issue quickly, it could have negative repercussions. Now, in my career in Japan, one thing I've noticed is that non-Japanese people, myself included, the knee-jerk reaction tends to be, well, we need to go directly to the highest level of management possible. We need to demand an answer quickly, and we need to convey our concerns directly to them as clearly as possible. And we cannot wait a moment longer. This needs to be done immediately. Um, Whereas I think the traditional Japanese, and I hate to generalize, but my observed experience so far has been, of course, let's be a little more indirect about this. Let's collect a few more people's opinions. Let's be very careful about when we float this message up, and let's go sort of not directly to the top level of management, but let's think about, okay, who do we have a good relationship with who's maybe one level up from us, who can then help us find someone subsequently at the next highest level, who can then ultimately help us forge a path not to the top manager, but perhaps to the person just below them. So there's a lot more sensitivity to who are we speaking to, who's the right person to convey this message, what is the right timing, but just getting that buy-in from a lot of different people, and then having that willingness to sort of take a more circuitous route. So perhaps you float the idea up one level in the organization, and then that person says, okay, I understand what you're trying to say, but let's address this point first before taking this up to the next highest level. So you need to have that willingness to then circle back to point A, or to, to where the message originated from, polish it up a little bit, float it back up one level, and then hopefully it can then proceed to the next level beyond that. So there's just a lot more, it's nemawashi, right? It's getting that consensus, making sure that the message is perhaps inferred, but not maybe directly stated in a way that would, harnish, tarnish anyone's reputation. So that's kind of a message delivery model. And then, of course, in conversation, in meetings, right? I mean, the classic example, and I'm surprised how often I see this at Recten, even in such a diverse environment. But I guess perhaps I shouldn't be. Is someone will present an idea, in a meeting, and of course, 100% of meetings must involve some sort of PowerPoint presentation at Recton. That's part of the corporate culture. If you don't have a PowerPoint, people will not listen to you. That's sort of an inside joke for anyone who's worked at Recton. But people will invite feedback, and what I've noticed is that the non-Japanese members of the team will be very openly critical in the meeting and say, I like what you're trying to do here, but what about this? Or why did you choose to phrase it this way? Or what about this piece of data you missed out on? Right there in the meeting, in front of everybody. And for a certain kind of person, that's very comfortable and it's something they can respond to quickly. And for other kinds of people, it feels very confrontational and it feels like, well, why are you attacking me, right? So, just recently we had a conversation at work about creating brave spaces, which for anyone who's unfamiliar with the concept, I think by now we're probably all very well versed in the idea of psychological safety, of having psychologically safe places at work to communicate, which is where environments where people feel free expressing their true ideas without fear of repercussions. And a brave space is kind of an extension of that idea. So if we can level up the idea of safe space, brave space is then creating an environment in which we can openly disagree with each other and challenge each other and have those uncomfortable conversations right there in the middle of the workday because we trust each other enough to understand that we have each other's best intentions in mind. We're both interested in creating the best possible outcome. And what we found is that the members of the team who come from North America and from Europe, and a couple of the Japanese members who have like extensive overseas experience or extensive experience working with foreign people, they see the value in this idea of brave space and they're ready to try it. They're saying, okay, yeah, let's do this. I see the value in it. I think we're capable of it. But a lot of the members of the team who are perhaps more domestically based or more, conservative in their opinions or whatever, and not coincidentally, I think all of whom are Japanese, they needed a lot more convincing that this is a good idea, that this is an idea we're ready for. Certainly, they need more time before they're ready to participate in brave space discussions, right? Now, why is this? We can sort of throw up our hands in the air and say, well, it's just a cultural difference. It's never going to happen. But I think it really comes back to an idea that we always talked about at Link Global Solution, which is the concept, and it really does come from people's educational training, the idea that a person and that person's idea, the idea that they're presenting in a conversation or in a meeting, a person and their idea are separate. They're not inherently the same unit. And I think if you come from a certain kind of educational background or a certain region in the world, that idea is kind of obvious. It's kind of baked into your everyday way of communication, right? But what I've found is that for a lot of people in Japan who are based in Japan, grown up in Japan, that idea is not obvious, right? When I present my idea, I feel a very strong association with that idea. I almost feel as if that idea is a part of me. Therefore, if my idea is being attacked in a public setting, in a professional setting, like a meeting, where perhaps my direct supervisor is also attending, the idea of someone then attacking that idea or challenging that idea is taken very personally, and people simply do not have the training to be able to respond to that. um, so that to me has been the clearest example of a difference between you know one style of communication and another, and that's where a lot of localization work or a lot of message massaging, to use the term you used, Tim, is required, right? It's just understanding those motivations and those kind of traditions that are underpinning the ways in which people communicate, because it's more than just a concept of language. It's what kind of emotional training, what kind of education have you had to get you to this point, and depending on where you come from and what your experiences are, that can be very, very different.